So I'll start off first of all around the role of council in capacity building. We've heard in the conference here about individual capacity building, organisational capacity building, and if I could just ask each of the panellists, so you can take an opportunity to introduce yourself, but just talk about your thoughts on the roles of council in capacity building. Roger, if we started with you maybe first, and we'll come this way.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that. I just wanted to say that, as Mark has said, that my experience in this field is not probably only gained for, definitely not as only gained by local government, so it's a wide-ranging involvement in this area. I even have the claim to fame with another gentleman in this room to have been on the panel that gave the hip-hop grant out. So you could argue I was part of the demise of social enterprise earlier on. It was a brilliant decision, and the woman that got the grant is still doing wonderful things in the Wellington community. In terms of capacity building, I think the other thing that's interesting in this space is that really most of the local government in New Zealand has really got out of the business of community development, let alone community economic development. So I think in the context of capacity building, it's a real challenge for local government. We were commented yesterday that local government really is the residual government of New Zealand, the government that does everything that the other government doesn't want to do. And I think that's a two-edged sword, because I think we are picking up a lot of stuff from central government that perhaps we aren't the best to handle, and I think we are picking up stuff that central government should be handling, and we should be advocating to do it. So capacity building is definitely needed, and I think, and I'd be prepared to others on the panel and others in the audience to see where they feel in the rankings scale that capacity building is happening out there at the moment, and I would rate it quite low.
Okay, Joanne, your experience.
Thanks. Yeah, something I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about, given that my title's Community Capacity Building Officer Social Enterprise over the last 4.5 years, and it's an interesting role to try and play, because it very much, as Mark has framed it, it's not something you want to be taking a lead in, but it's something you want to be facilitating and supporting. And I suppose the other thing I should say up front is that the local government in Australia is structured a little differently from in the UK and in New Zealand, as I understand it, in that we don't deliver a lot of community services. That's primarily done by our state government. So it creates quite a different climate in terms of social enterprise and social innovation. And that's been something as a sector we've had to grapple with in Australia quite a lot, because a lot of the best practice, I suppose, that's coming through is from quite a different place. Saying that, there are I think I've always advocated that it's really important, if you're working inside government, and particularly local government level, to look for roles and to support the roles that are appropriate to local government context. So you need to look at what other things within there are roles for many different types of organisations. And there's a whole lot of things that local government can do that don't actually need to cost them very much money, and that's always a message that people are I find welcome hearing when they particularly sit inside local government, because my role in Australia is a unique role. It's not like every government has a position like this. And so there's a lot of things around reframing how you do business, basically around things like procurement, around assets, which we've heard a bit at this conference, but also things like developing that further, leveraging your supply chains, brokering partnerships and consortia, so you're actually really taking the core business of your local government and looking to leverage that for outcomes for social enterprises. But in addition to that, one of the things that I would say, and probably pertinently at the current timing for what's happening here in Auckland, is that a critical thing is to have something embedded in your high-level strategic planning documents that actually is what I call the hook that you can hang this work from. Because it might be okay now while you've got support from people to take this agenda forward, but when you're doing long-term strategic planning, it's normally 25, 30 years, and if you don't have a hook in there that you can build this work around, it may not be sustainable in the longer term. And having said that, I have yet to achieve that in my own council, so it's not something that's very easy to do. And then the other thing that I'd say that's a really useful role, and we're still in the middle of this in Sydney, is to incubate the capacity building of other organisations. So don't try to necessarily do all of it yourself, and look for ways that you can stimulate and create energy around capacity building for social enterprise amongst other external bodies as well.
Thank you. Ingrid.
I'm the only one on the panel who's not actually involved with local government from the inside, and all of my experience has been actually engaging with local government from the outside. I think local government at the moment is in a really big dilemma, because I actually agree with Joanne. I think local government doesn't have a huge role in capacity building directly, and in a lot of ways the role now is shifting to how can local government not just enable but also get out of the way of civil society organisations. I think the dilemma though is that in Australia, because we're over-governed and we have 3 levels of government, local government is the closest to the people. So someone raised yesterday, the idea of wicked problems. They are the closest to the wicked problems which are expressed in place. And so, people on the street don't necessarily understand that that's not their remit. So local governments all around Australia are getting lots of calls about how they can be involved in addressing some of these very wicked problems. And in some ways, I think the role of local government in relation to those problems is shifting. One of the issues I think that local government is going to face is the silo within local government, because those problems at community level are not just about economic development, they're not just about community development, they're not just about procurement, they're about all of those things, and bringing all of those things together in an organisation that's huge. And Brisbane City Council is bigger than some of the state governments whose names I won't mention. That they are the coalface. So part of the capacity building role is actually educating the general public about what their remit is and being open to engaging with community members about how they can use their councils most effectively.
Thank you. Just before I ask Penny to speak, we only have 10 more minutes, so I'm wondering if a better focus would be for each of you to think about a particular aspect that you'd like to recommend, you'd prioritise for either policy work across the country or at a local level or whatever. So have a think about what you might say in relation to that. Penny, over to you on the same kind of question about capacity building.
Sure. And I just took capacity building at its face value and completely agree with everything that was said. For me, there's probably 3 key and practical things. Local government can spot talent in the community and can grow that talent, bringing experts out here to talk to conferences like this that are affordable, by taking our community people and sending them for training to places, like the Community Development Agency, Tamarack, that sort of thing. I think is really practical. We can include social enterprise in some of our mainstream events, like our Waitakere Business Awards. Of course, you should have social enterprise there, right up front. And thirdly, employing community brokers, and I love the idea of the capacity building person within staff. What I really like is spotting our community stars and employing them, embedding community in local government, and then embedding local government in the community, so that we do have that reciprocal process, so that we break those silos down and we understand each other's worlds.
Thank you. Okay, so as I said, I think maybe the best way we can focus for the next 10 minutes is maybe choosing a topic that each of you would like to focus on, and when you've said your piece, I'll ask if anyone else wants to comment in relation to it. So, does anyone want to start with one?
I think to start on a couple of the other points is the changing role of local government. I think we're in absolutely fundamental change time, and one of the real roles is picking up the point made that we are and should be the closest to the people, but we're not the people. And I think that role of being the facilitator of the people's conversation is increasingly the role of local government. I happen to wear another hat. I wear a lot of hats. The International Association of Public Participation, which I'm the Australasian secretary, and I found out that Joanna was on the board some years ago too. But there is a real pressure right across Australasia for people to understand better how to work with the public, how to listen to the public, how to engage with the public, and basically bring back that government is about the people and for the people. And I think we have gone too far the other way in my experience of local government into managerialism, KPIs, research-based decisions, and that whole structure. So I think the real challenge for local government is to let go, as Penny said, that strategic broker. I know Waitakere were doing that. People, and they may be better employed by the community than they are by council itself, but have people working in that broker role, I think, is really the way ahead. So we've really got to get out of our thinking of that paternal model of doing good to the community to actually letting the community do it for themselves.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? No? Joanne, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Sure. So a couple of areas that I think are, again, coming back to that comment I made earlier about the context of local government, that are probably, in my opinion, from the last few years of work, the closest to the central core work of local government that I think are worth investing, and I mean investing, like actually putting money into developing your capabilities as local government in these areas, is around procurement and assets. And Ingrid's our resident wonderful expert in Australia that we have in this area, and has done some really significant research that's made a huge difference to those agendas in Australia. And I'll talk about it from my perspective of sitting inside government and trying to make some of that stuff work when you sit inside a bureaucracy with the best intentions. For procurement, it's critical, I think, from a local government perspective that you're looking at procurement across the triple bottom line. Local government has many competing responsibilities, and in something as core as your procurement practices, it's very difficult and I would say probably not appropriate to be privileging some of those over others without a very considered process around that. So we're working through a process in Parramatta at the moment where we're trying to embed a sustainable procurement framework within our procurement practice, and that's been an incredibly long and painful process that's gone on for way too long, and it's actually going to our council tonight. And the reason that we've done it that way is because it actually brings together social, local economic development and environmental considerations into procurement. That was a very hard decision for me to make, being somebody who works in social enterprise and has always been looking at it from the social procurement angle and wanting to see that embedded in council. But working through the issues from a local government perspective, it came to the realisation that it was going to be much more sustainable and also much more appropriate and potentially give better outcomes if we actually looked at it across that spectrum. Similarly with assets, it has been the biggest challenge of my job to try and bring our assets people closely behind the procurement people, but yes, the assets people along on this, and we're just starting to get some glimmers that they might actually understand what we're talking about. But to me, it's one of the areas that has the biggest potential for local government to offer this sector is around the work that you can do in putting to use your underutilised assets. I just can't say that strongly enough, because the asset base is what you've got to go forward on, and if you don't have that, you're always tenuous. But having said that, social finance of course, but having said that, the other part that I would like to make around this is that when you work inside government, all of these kinds of decisions are predicated on the premise that social impact is being achieved. And when you work inside government, it's not enough to say social impact is being achieved. You actually need to be able to demonstrate that. When I go to my procurement officers, when I go to my assets people and say we want to do this and we're going to help this kind of organisation, the first thing they want to know is how do you know that that's actually going to deliver the kind of impact you want to do. And we're nowhere near close to being able to do that globally as yet. There are models and methods that are out there. And so one thing that I would say really strongly to any local government people in the room is to try to implement stuff with using social impact methods, and to document and to share amongst your peers in other local governments your experiences of that, because the more that we can grow the knowledge in that area, the faster that we'll accelerate this whole agenda. And until we get that piece right in the core of it, it's very challenging to move some of those debates along.
Thank you. Ingrid.
I'd like to take the other side of the fence and say what are the challenges for community development workers and people in community organisations in engaging with councils. And I want to put two controversial things on the agenda. I think the big challenge in community economic development is for community development workers and community organisations to learn the language of economics and be able to speak their language of economics to local government. And to work out where the innovation potentials are, because I think it's actually economically inefficient for local governments not to engage in community economic development. And the reason I got into the economics and the business and the procurement and the finance space was because as a community development worker, I was really frustrated that we weren't actually moving things along. When you start speaking the language, you can create differences. When you can start demonstrating the impacts, you can start creating changes and policy changes. That's number one. Number two, which is even more controversial, so I'll say it really quickly, is I think that there is an issue around assets. The challenge for community organisations is to bring the challenges up before the council has to bring them up. Peppercorn rents, I think, is a big issue, and I think it's an issue for this long-term sustainability of community organisations. We've had a situation in Brisbane where we've had some organisations who have paid peppercorn rents for 20 plus years, and the council has reviewed its assets and decided that they would like to commercialise their assets. And so those organisations, because they've been used to paying $1 a year rent, have not thought strategically about how they could possibly afford commercial rents in that sort of environment. So they have no planning, so they're out. That's bad for council because they're pushing community organisations out, and it's really, really bad for community organisations. So I think we need to raise that conversation before councils have to raise it.
Thank you. We will be... Rachel's going to give us a hand with roving mic, so if you have a question afterwards, but Penny, maybe if you make a final comment before we go to open questions.
Sorry, I've been so busy writing down what they're saying. I'm feeling I just want to listen to more of this. There's probably three quick things. Number one, I think Ingrid is extraordinary, having just done her workshop. I was pretty excited in a slightly anorakish sort of way about procurement policy. I now think it's probably one of the biggest levers we've got as local government to make transformative change. It's as important to me as the health reforms which require, or hopefully will end up requiring, public health to be at the top of the cliff before we start funding hospitals. It's kind of on a par with that, so I think it is critical. But it suddenly strikes me that one of the most important things we need to do as a community is to ramp up our understanding of economics, and I think what Ingrid has just said is so critical. It's easy for councils to be dismissive and government to be dismissive of communities because we don't speak treasury language. There's another language of economics, and I think it's the economics we've been hearing in the last 2 days. And we simply need, for those of us who are able to do some of that capacity building, to capacity build that knowledge in our communities, because I absolutely agree with what was said. We are at the absolute cusp of local government being entirely different. I'm now sitting on a council that has assets worth $39 billion and an annual budget of $1.3 billion. If we get it wrong, it will be cataclysmic. If we get it right, it will be transformative. And we can only do that by finding the right ways to have these discussions with community. Two quick other things. Community assets. I think the discussion around community assets is a really big one. I'm very scared of going to my council and saying let's hand community assets over to the community, because that simply isn't going to happen. We need to find a partnership way of approaching that kind of mutualised, I'm learning the language now, approach, which I think, again, looking at embedding long-term policies that protect our community, I think that's a critical one that stops asset stripping. Secondly, I think we need to have some really grown-up discussions as community, and my challenge out there is, and knowing a lot of people in the audience, we'll have these discussions in here at a theoretical level, and then we'll all go to our ratepayers groups and moan at the council for putting the rates up. If we're going to do the kind of procurement policies that we're talking about, they're not going to be the cheapest way to do things. And I think we need to start absolutely having that economic discussion with our community. Cheapest is actually expensive in the long run. And I think I would like each and every one of you to be the advocates for that discussion out to our community. Because as a politician, that's the place where I fall flat on my face. I go out from here full of enthusiasm and drive, and then someone just says, so what's the rates increase going to be? And it takes the wind out of my sails. So we need to have that more grown-up discussion. And finally, procurement policy. That's my homework. I've got the book. Please talk to your elected members about how important that is.
Excellent, thank you. Best price? No. Best value?
Absolutely.
Yes.